Hello, everyone. I invite everybody to have a seat and kind of get situated because I think we're going to try to get started as soon as possible. We have, I think, about an hour for this discussion. We'll try to make up some time, so bear with us if we move a little quickly. My name is Yukyan. I'm the research director at the Tishman Center at the New School. And we are a center that supports environmental justice by working closely with frontline EJ organizations and partners. We support them with evidence, advocacy, support, research support. Basically, whatever they need, we are there and trying to help them meet those needs. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to the panelists. It'll be abbreviated, but longer bios are here on this table. To my left, we have Ryke, who is the Director of Clinical Programs and the Director of Environmental Law and Policy. He's also a policy clinic. He's also the John H. Adams Clinical Professor of Law at Duke University's Law School. Next, we have Sofia Owen. She is a senior attorney and director of EJ Legal Services Program at Alternatives for Community and Environment. And she has also served on the EPA's NEJAC, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council for EPA Region 1 since 2021. And finally, last but not least, we have Maria Lopez Nunez, who's the Deputy Director for the Ironbound Community Corporation. She's an EJ organizer. She's on the board of the Climate Justice Alliance, and she's also currently serving on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Amongst the work she's done, she's helped to pass the country's strongest cumulative impacts law in New Jersey a few years ago that many of us, I think, have heard of. So I'm going to give a little bit of motivation for today's panel. So when we started planning this with Amy Laura at Taproot a few months ago, we realized, there are many sectors that are obviously implicated in the conversation for climate justice and a just transition. And we started to think about, well, what kind of conversation could we actually motivate that would have these kind of relevance for cross-sector strategies? And what we kind of realized was in every sector, whatever topic you're working on, there's on the one hand presented a set of what we call false solutions, solutions that don't get us what we want. And then there's a set of real solutions. So the proposition for today's talk is to have a bit of this shared analysis and to ask our panelists to share with us examples of specific work or sectors that they work on. What are the false solutions that they are seeing in those sectors? And if we can start to pull out some common threads, notice common patterns, then maybe that helps us kind of work together and mobilize together and share best practices, learnings, et cetera. At the same time, for those sectors or examples, what are the real solutions that folks are working on, and how do we know that they are real? There's kind of a two-part discussion there because we want to understand a bit about the substance. How do we know that these are real solutions? How do we know that they are reparative, transformative? And then the second kind of part of that is a lot of these solutions tend to be long-term, right? And so in the meantime, how do we track progress? How do we know we are going in the right direction? What are the wins that we can actually point to? I think many of us face the pressure to be able to point to those wins. Sometimes that's coming from philanthropy, sometimes that's coming from other places. And even just kind of knowing that you're moving in the right direction, that is something I think that we, across all sectors, across all the work we do, that's something we want to identify. So we'll have kind of this three-part discussion. In the interest of time, we probably won't have as much of the pair share where you're talking amongst yourselves, but of course we invite you to take that conversation out to the lunch hour. So let us get started then. So with the first question here, false solutions, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to tell us what it means to them, how it relates to a specific example or a sector that they want to speak about. What pervasive patterns do we notice? So, Ryke, let me start with you.
Thank you for this, and I want to echo, we're talking about false solutions, comments and discussion that we had in the earlier plenary. If a lawyer is presenting you with a solution, that might be a clue that it's a false solution. So that's one of the things we might look for. And why do I say that? Well, I say that because as lawyers, our training tends to be focused around a specific system and the rules that generated that system. And the rules that generated that system, and those are important things for lawyers to understand, and that's the world in which we operate. And since I teach at a law school, I'm teaching law students how to operate in that space as well. But those rules themselves can become obstacles to thinking creatively about what is actually really possible. Come on in, there's more seats over here as well. So I do think that I want to say, first off, that's one of the things that I look at when we say that. Another is an echo of what we talked about a little bit earlier about the PCB protests in Warren County. I want to say very clearly when I talk to students about that set of events, I like to think of that as an example of litigation as being a part of a strategy, but it was the losing part of that strategy. There was a court case about the PCB landfill location. The advocates who brought that forward made a perfect case scientifically and legally as to why the landfill should not be permitted. They lost nevertheless. The organization and the mobilization, the nonviolent direct action campaign that was surrounding those PCB protests, those were ultimately successful in many ways. Litigation was not. But that doesn't mean that there's not a role for law to play in these fault solutions. So another thing I look for is when somebody starts talking to me about something being a win-win, especially if they're coming into a community and they want to say, we got a win-win to talk with you about. That's another sort of red flag that I think communities need to look for. Because the win-win usually comes about by defining in advance from outside the community what a win looks like. And defining from the outside a win is itself a false solution because it is not following the HIMSS principles, it's not coming from a grounding in community, and it is not focused on that. And it's often foreshortened by an idea of what's politically possible and what's advantageous to the proponent. And the proponent almost always has a strong financial interest in why this is the right way to go. So that's really a sales job, right? That's not a conversation. We can have conversations, we can have dialogues, or we can allow ourselves to be brought into sales jobs. So I think that those are some things that I would point to, and I'm going to pass it on to my panelists to add their thoughts.
Thanks, Ryke. I'm Sofia, and I'm actually going to just jump into one specific example that I know is near and dear to Maria's heart as well. But how many of y'all know about the Transportation and Climate Initiative? Okay, cool. Not that many. So the idea behind that was to create, which is good. We want that because it's a false solution. We're going to start there. And because we killed it. So the idea behind TCI was to create a regional solution to transportation emissions. And the idea was to put a price on the cost of fuel upstream for like the fuel suppliers who bring fuel to like gas stations, all that kind of stuff. Basically, it's a backdoor gas tax without having to justify raising a tax. And for like 10 years, the Georgetown Climate Center and state officials from Maine all the way down to DC were involved in conversations about how do we create this thing, what does it look like? And they had that conversation and then made the announcement that they were going to be doing a public process to take input on this thing. Without getting any input from the folks on the front lines, from the organizations that work with the folks on the front lines, and without thinking about what a policy like that would mean for the people most burdened by the problems of our transit system. So, I mean, I feel like we could talk about this for days, but we're not going to. And what I want to share is that organizations like ACE, Green Roots, Ironbound, and all of our fellow co-conspirators in the Climate Justice Alliance Northeast region came together and said, hell no, we don't want this. And we met pretty much every week, if not every 2 weeks, spent a lot of time together figuring out what our plan was, and we went in and disrupted the decision-making process. And some of this happened actually before I was at ACE, so Maria, feel free to jump in. But folks went and actually disrupted the spaces where meetings about this were being held. So like there was a meeting in Newark where people actually came in and shut down the meeting and made some demands around things being shifted, asked for a pause until our input could be provided and then our questions answered. We also did popular education with our own people to explain to them why this was a false solution. And then the last thing that we did was we called in the big greens, some of our allies, and some of our funders who were actively supporting this proposal. And in doing all of that, we were able to get the NRDC and Sierra Club to change their positions on the proposal. Yes. Yes. And Earth Justice, who hadn't been engaging directly on the policy, actually came out with a letter and said, we are opposed to this thing. Y'all get your stuff together. So thank you to those of you from Earth Justice who were here and had something to do with that. I want to say a thing about funders real quick, because there are one of the biggest funders in the Northeast region was very involved in supporting TCI. And they are also the biggest funder for my organization. And the first meeting that I had with that funder, they were talking to us about TCI, and our executive director and I basically said, nah, we're not, we will come to those meetings, we will share what we think, but this is bullshit, basically. And I came out of that meeting wondering, like, what's gonna happen with our funding? But the thing I wanna share is that we led with our vision, we held people accountable, and we have a great relationship with that funder, and they have actually shifted how they are thinking about funding transportation work now because of that. So want to share that win, and then just sort of the big picture what happened. The proposal for TCI fell apart, part of it because it relied on basically all of the states buying into this false solution, which they didn't. And it was a weird kind of, it was a weird thing in that we were opposed to this thing, but industry was also opposed to this thing, so we weren't working with them, but their opposition, we know, played a role in it falling apart. The last thing I think I want to say is just that it also changed how our relationships look with some of the decision makers in our own state. So in Massachusetts, we now have direct relationships with some of the agency staff who are thinking about these things, and I had people working at our state DEP come up to me and say, thank you for taking the time to educate us on this. It is changing how we think about doing these things. It is changing how we are thinking about creating community meetings and doing things differently. So even if I guess I'll just say, it is a false solution. I do feel like our organizations should be paid for the amount of time and energy that we all spent fighting this thing. And I think sometimes even when we don't win, we still can change behavior. And so I want to highlight that. And then the last thing is just that I think we were very consistent in what we did want instead, which was mandatory emissions reductions in places where folks are most overburdened by pollution from transportation and infrastructure, and other things like the equitable electrification of public transit and the siting of that infrastructure, making sure that we're not just entrenching the same reality, even if we're pivoting to renewable and ostensibly clean energy.
Thank you.
Before I go to Maria, I just wanted to add a few comments actually on the TCI, because I was actually at the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, at a time working as a scientist there, and I am a public health scientist, and I think one of the threads that I saw in TCI and that I'm seeing now with things like carbon capture and sequestration is there's a desire to take science and basically weaponize it. And what was really important in that specific case, what we saw was, okay, so they understood at some point that the carbon-centric paradigm is not enough. It's not going to get people to support your policy, right? And which is, by the way, its own sort of feature of many false solutions is that carbon centrism. And so they were presenting data to the communities, to others, to say, hey, there's going to be these moderate public health benefits from TCI. And they had a number of very reputable academic institutions involved.
Harvard, Yale.
They had big names, right? And they had scientists involved. And they came in with these tables. And so when I was at NRDC and I had heard from Maria, it was one of the first things when I met Maria, she told me, watch out for TCI. I started to look a little bit more at those tables.
You have to pressure your partners inside these institutions. You don't have to be friendly all the time. I'm your friend. I'm going to tell you what's real.
We looked at those tables, and what we noticed was these moderate health benefits, when you were looking at the numbers, they were so small. And at the same time, those projections presented they gave no information about the level of uncertainty in what they were actually estimating. So they couldn't even say that those supposed small benefits were bigger or were more likely to happen than just like random chance, basically. And when we finally pointed that out internally at NRDC, I think that was one of the things that really helped kind of shift leadership in their view of the program. And so I think, as this next tranche of false solutions are coming at us, hopefully we can also really tackle how science is being misused.
No, absolutely. And, so, hey, I'm Maria. And let's just say here, that was an intense fight. But, I had a whole different way I'm going, but I'm going to take 2 minutes on this because it was a great case study of we just, honestly, you don't need thousands of people. We didn't have thousands of people on a carbon mechanism. I'm not even going to try to explain this, but when we did, they're going to raise your gas without telling you. How is it that some state bureaucrats get to 100 of them from 13 states total? That's not a lot of bureaucrats, right? That's 10 per state. They take out taxpayer dollars and they go to the middle of Boston. I remember when I found out about that meeting, I was like, damn, it's kind of expensive to go. I had to get solidarity housing, right? And I'm the leader of my organization, but I'm not going to pay $600 for a room in the middle of Boston and trying to get to that meeting, right? And then when we're there, we were the only black and brown people in the room, right? Because it was all white bureaucrats that we walked up into their meeting. They had the equity panel at the end of this session because they were there for technical design. And so, we blew their stuff up. I was I see my bureaucrats here. I got questions as a taxpayer. How are y'all going to make decisions for 160 million people that raises their tax, right? And I was and our folks pay the most. And I was I understand I want to get rid of gas, but how ridiculous is it that we want to reduce transportation emissions, but we're not going to invest in public transportation? We're going to create this weird formula that the states have control over, and then we're going to decide where that money goes later, right? And also the gas companies are just going to pass the price back on to us. So you use our money to get more money from us from a different way? Hell no, right? But then I'll be clear, NRDC only came out against it at the end, right? When actually 12 states had already dropped out, oh, wow, so risky to come out then. Earth Justice came out first, right? And I think that this matters, not pitting people against each other, but just who's your ally? Who's willing to risk their neck out? Because when we were out there, we were all losing funding, right? Not only was it not paid, we were actively losing funding for fighting something that our funders really thought was a great idea. And maybe just work with them to make it a little bit better. And I think that that's key in terms of defining a win on false solutions. False solutions are, first off, solutions, I don't know who came up with this language. It happened a little while back, but we shouldn't even have solutions in the name because these are damn scams, right? They're tax fraud, okay? A lot of things in the IRA are great. I'm not going to shit on that, but there's a lot of things in the IRA that are tax fraud, right? That is just calling fossil fuels by a different name, right? So when we're talking about clean energy, nobody's defined what clean energy is. So clean energy, which I think it should just be carbon-free energy, right? That's really what a lot of big institutions are pushing. It's not clean. It doesn't consider public health impacts, right? Hydrogen produces NOx, which in our communities has been killing us for decades. We've been trying to fight back against NOx. So how is it that now there's hydrogen hubs? Hydrogen is not financially feasible by itself, right? It's way too damn expensive to produce. To produce hydrogen, 95% of it gets produced by using fossil fuels. Then they're trying to sell you this scam on green hydrogen, which is like 5%, right? 5%. But we have to divert renewable energy. So instead of renewable energies being used on the grid, we're going to divert them to create green hydrogen because maybe it could be used in battery cells for trucks. So I'm like, oh, so we're going to risk our whole communities and our whole futures on this like little percentage where it is feasible, even though we know what fossil fuels will do once they're in, right? Like they're putting the little tolls in and they're going to go, the whole body's in all of a sudden. And that's exactly what's happening with our tax code. When we're talking about things, maybe I'm getting too nerdy, so I can pull it back too. We're talking about things like direct pay. Direct pay is for nonprofits, municipal governments, tribal governments, right? And the only for-profit corporations that have access to direct pay are hydrogen, CCS, and advanced manufacturing, right? Advanced fuels, which is just, they take the carbon from the air, suck it down, enhanced oil recovery, and then sell it back to you when United's like, you're on a, carbon-free ride. It's just like really misusing of the energy sector in order to sell us all these scams, which is just, I can't listen to more NPR stuff that's funded by Exxon, who is giving me an ad about how they're fixing the future, right? So we really got to be looking out for that and look alive, right? Because our communities don't, I don't know the difference. If I'm hearing it, I want to believe it's a good thing, right? So we're almost like working against people's own like optimism. They want to be optimistic that someone's working on this, and we're all desperate to believe. So I think it's definitely a time when we need truth-telling, and we need black and brown folks to really, we know how to look alive, right? So that's what we need to be putting more more of our faces out there, talking about these things and not leaving it to, white folks or people who are maybe quote unquote more educated and have the right degrees. Law, medicine, science, they all created their own language just to leave us out of it, right? But common sense will tell you, you can't suck carbon out of the air and then just push it back in the ground and don't worry about it, right? I think we know better than that. So it's definitely, I think, a time for us to be paying attention. That's what I think false scams are, like just scams. Like, let's not fall for them. Sorry for taking up all that.
I will turn it back to Ryke to give us one of his examples before we close out this kind of first segment. But one thing we will definitely note, especially in this era of, we got to do something about climate change, is that law and the courts have actually also been used to further these false scams, right? And we have heard, well, what can the EPA really do because their hands are tied because of this West Virginia versus EPA decision, right? And so, that has not been our friend in this, and we are very actively criticizing the EPA for what it is doing, what it's proposing to do, which is to uphold hydrogen co-firing and carbon capture as supposedly the way to set power sector GHG rules. So, let me turn it to Ryke so that he can talk an example, and then we will move on to the second segment.
Just a quick example from North Carolina. So in this state, there are more pigs than there are people at any given time. And most of them are located in 10 counties. 10 counties in North Carolina, we're a 100-county state. We're small counties. 10 counties in North Carolina, if they were their own state, would be the third largest pig producer in the country. And those 3 counties are historically black and brown counties. These are counties that were slave economies during the antebellum South. They were centers of racial oppression during Jim Crow. They also happen to be communities where indigenous people and American Indians living in North Carolina are located. You're much more likely to be local near one of these hog farms if you are a black or brown person than a white person. Now, the farms themselves are owned overwhelmingly by white people. 92% of the swine CAFOs in North Carolina are owned and operated by white families. So the farms themselves are owned by them. One of the things that happened back in the 60s was NC State scientists were trying to solve a problem. The problem was people in Europe and people in Asia didn't want to import pork from North Carolina and from the United States generally because there were soil-borne diseases that they were trying to avoid. So their solution to that problem was to put pigs off of land. Instead of doing what Donna and her family had done, they put them inside buildings. Then once they got them inside buildings so close together, they had to figure out a way to keep them from being killed by the odors and smells they created in that space. They put fans on them and ventilation, and they put a big toilet bowl underneath it, and they flushed all that waste out into something they called a lagoon. Now, lagoons produce methane. Fault solution is this. Pigs themselves don't produce a lot of methane. Cows do. Now, let's just be very clear. Cows produce methane as just part of their digestion. Pigs don't produce a whole lot of methane. Swine waste lagoons do. A number of lawyers and activists in North Carolina for 30 years have been trying to get rid of swine waste lagoons because of health impacts on communities and because of adverse environmental impacts. And that's included legal action. The Southern Environmental Law Center has been very active in that, which is one of our local nonprofit law firms. And we've been pushing for that for years. Well, along comes climate change and this idea of climate change mitigation. And the hog lagoon owners were like, oh, we'll digest this and get the methane out, but we're going to leave the lagoons and spray fields there in the community, but we're going to make that a green solution because we're reducing methane. Well, the way to reduce methane is to get rid of the hog lagoons in the first place, because then you don't create it. But see if they create it and then they can sell it, right? So what they're doing is selling that. So that's another indication of the false solution, is you create a problem and then you turn around and say to the taxpayers and the ratepayers, hey, here's a solution. You just need to pay us to haul away the thing that we created in the first place. And so that's one of the issues I wanted to bring to attention. The same thing is true with wood pellet biomass and a number of other solutions that we see present here in North Carolina. And with that, I'll turn it back. Thank you.
Yeah, it's always, again, I go into a little bit of the scientist thinking. I think a lot of the analysis of the false solutions that we have is like they define the bounds of what they're analyzing. And very infrequently do we see something that's actually an honest life cycle accounting for the whole process. The same with hydrogen, with carbon capture, all of these. So the next segment, we want to actually talk about the solutions that we do need for a just transition. And I'm going to go to each of the panelists. I think I'll start with Sofia this time to tell us a little bit about the solutions that their organizations are working towards. Specifically, what is about these solutions that make them real? What makes them reparative? What makes them transformative? How do you know that they're actually just? There's, I think, a process component, right, in terms of consulting and who's in the room, but then probably a substantive component as well. So if you can comment on one or the other. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that distinction is really important, that there's procedural justice and there's substantive justice. Procedural meaning what is the process that brings people to the table? What are the rules of the game? How do people engage? And then the substance is what the outcome actually is. So you can have a process that brings lots of people to the table, but creates the same inequity. And that's one of the things to look out for. Is there actually decision-making power for the people most impacted by the problem in creating the outcome? And then the other thing that I just wanted to really briefly mention in terms of the no-brainer of this kind of stuff, my boss at one point when we were talking about TCI asked people if they watched Sesame Street, and then asked people if they've seen this bit that was around when I was a kid of this dude who comes onto Sesame Street and sells Ernie an empty bottle, and he sells it as a bottle full of air, and Ernie buys the bottle. And Dwayne basically was like, that's TCI. That's Reggie. That's what we don't need. And I thought that was really powerful because it's so clear, right? But those are the kind of things to look out for. And then the other thing is just is the money, are they saying the equity and the money is going to come on the back end? Which is the case with TCI. One of the things that they were saying was it'll bring down emissions, it'll improve public health, and then there will be money raised by this program that will come to your communities. Please. We know that that's not happening. So in terms of the good stuff, one example that I can give is that we have been involved at ACE on the local level fighting for a more equitable policy around building emissions. And one of the things that we did was, so we were involved in a collaborative process with the city of Boston that was facilitated by a third-party facilitator to help, in terms of the power imbalance, give us the ability to actually negotiate with the city in a meaningful way. And that policy isn't perfect. It is still, within the like putting a price on carbon and capitalist space, but we kept offsets out of that policy, and we created a review board where 2/3 of the people who are nominated to the review board that's actually going to implement and enforce this thing are accountable to and nominated by community-based organizations. And that was the first of its kind for the city of Boston. So that was a big win. And the other thing that we did in that process, just in terms of thinking about like how you design policy, is we intentionally had meetings where we had the city come and talk about what they were considering in the design, and then we had real people, residents of Boston and members of our sister organizations in the housing justice space, say, here's what we hear you saying, here's what we're concerned about. We're concerned about gentrification and displacement. We're concerned about our energy bills going up, and we are concerned about air quality locally. So if this policy doesn't address those things, we're not on board. And so that gave us the ability to then go back to the city and say, you've heard this from this set of 200 people. How are you actually doing this? So I've spent the better part of the last 2 years now trying to hold them accountable to those promises and drafting the regulations. And I think the last thing I'll say is that I think that is one place where I think lawyers can be a big value add. Like, it doesn't just have to be in litigation and the courts. Most of what I do is actually in policy spaces, and that is where my heart is. And that, the thing I love about that is that I get to dream about the world we want to see. I'm not stuck with what the solutions are that, the EPA or the state is telling me they should be.
Yeah, I long to be, like inspirational, but I don't got that for you in terms of solutions right now, right? Like, I see myself as part of a long arc of history, and, it's just me, but it may be a reaction to this moment, but I'm like, oh yeah, like, transformation will come, and I will add my grain of salt to that. So what I have to offer right now is just more procedural solutions. Like the EJ law, as amazing as it is, it's so basic, right? It's so basic. Like, it requires the decision makers, when they're going to make a permit, instead of being like, you power plant, you exist in a bubble where no human being exists, right? And we can just look at your emissions. Now they have to be like, oh, there's a lot of other things going on here, which even as a kid, I would have assumed that that's what a Department of Environmental Protection does. But the fact that they don't have the power to look at things in context, something a 4-year-old can do can be like too many smokestacks in one neighborhood. Don't concentrate all the dirty things, right? Like, we have to spread them out at least. If we're going to be dirty, like, spread it. We all know, like, mom's coming to the room, put it in different corners, right? Like, some things are very basic, but then they're like, no, all the bad stuff here for black and brown people, right? So the EJ law just allows the Department of Environmental Protection to look around and say, oh, I guess not. And then it doesn't give them the option, right? It does say, if this is happening, you have to deny it. Because if we keep settling for assessments of like, oh, don't worry, we'll just assess the environmental conditions, we're going to lose. If we keep just settling for, don't worry, like what they're doing right now with CCS and hydrogen, there'll be a community benefits agreement. Community benefits agreements are not even about mitigating harm. They're just about getting you a job in your own destruction, right? Because all they're offering to us right now are workforce developments. And let's just be real, we're gonna be like low-level employees, right? Like, they're not trying to go find and promote us and become, not that we would want to, right? But it's not high-paying jobs. It's not like we got part ownership in this destructive new reality where the world's on fire, but we're rich. I don't think any of us want that, but that could be an alternative they would be offering too. No, so I think those are important for us to be like on the lookout for, and things where we can change the law, right? Like you said, a lot of people are worried about the current environment. Oh, Clean Air Act, the Supreme Court struck that. In the middle of that, Ironbound was teamed up with Earth Justice, Sierra Club, and East Yards, and we sued the EPA because they weren't implementing the parts of the Clean Air Act that they could, right? Because it's been on the books for a long time that every 5 years they should be revisiting incinerator standards. And they haven't since 2006. And so there are incinerators across the country that operate with hundreds of violations, but they're just in black and brown communities, so no one cares, right? And neither does EPA. Even though they were there crying about what had just been stripped from them, they weren't doing their damn job. I'm like, there's actually a lot of great laws in this country, but someone needs to enforce them. Someone needs to actually push agencies to do their damn job. I understand you ain't perfect and you don't got the resources you need, the staff you need. I have compassion for people in government. I assume best intentions. Who wants that job, right? You have people like me yelling at you. You got industry trying to bribe you. I have compassion for it. But I also think that that's what we need to make political cases, right? And in that sense, the best partnership for me for a just transition is when we have a case going on, because we had that case going on, right? And then we had some organizing happening, because I was like, we need to get this more visible. How do we get it more visibility? That's where we used the WeJack to send a letter. It wasn't a big deal, but it just brings more press attention, which pressures EPA. Like, why aren't you settling this and giving us a date? Like, let's get it moving, right? So we do need that interplay in any solution of no matter who's doing it, we need the community on the street backing it up. And if there's no one out on the street having your back, then who are you and who are you fighting for? Because clearly you don't represent nobody. And then, I can't be here screaming at you and saying I represent my community, but then my community is not actually outside, right? If they ain't coming, people know that. And then they ain't scared of you. You ain't scary unless you can back your words up, right, as a community organizer. And that's why I think we can't lose sight if we're on the streets, what are the tangible things we're asking for and who's in there demanding them, right, so that we can be lifting them up, pressuring them, and working with our folks on the inside so that we can figure out the weak spots of the system and keep pushing and trudging away at it, because I do think we'll win and that there is a beautiful future. I just don't know if I'm a part of it. I'm like just adding my little grain right now, little things here and there.
Any solutions that you're working on or the communities that you're working with are working towards that you're supporting?
Yeah, I think an important one, and I was happy to see that one of my clients is here, Susanna Tuttle, who will be talking this afternoon with Interfaith Power and Light here in North Carolina. One of the big problems we started realizing is, sometimes you're fighting in the wrong agency, and you don't even realize it at first. Where's the money? Follow the money. Where's it coming from? And in the case of some of these like power projects, it's the utilities commissions. And these were institutions that were set up in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. They were to solve a problem, and the problems they were set up to solve included things like creating and reinforcing Jim Crow. And so the utilities commissions themselves, in their very creation, were not thinking about issues of justice. And so justice was not part of their DNA, and they're not part of their current mission at all. You can't even find a link to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on the North Carolina Utilities Commission webpage, or a place to file an environmental justice complaint. There's not one on there. They don't even have a link, much less a person, much less a commitment. And so one of the things that we did was just start in the Utilities Commission process, which is an arcane process that even a lawyer who'd been practicing for 32 years like myself didn't understand until I started doing this work. So I think part of it is just trying to get that discussion. And recognizing that what you're usually offered is never enough. I worked in food service before I became a lawyer, and I remember very distinctly that the difference between Bojangles and Spinnakers was not the food quality, it was the garnish on the plate. And a lot of times what we're being given is the garnish on the plate, and we're being charged twice as much. The red and green, the little tomato slice or the orange slice and the piece of lettuce on the edge, that's what you're paying extra for, and that's what we see with some of these solutions. So I think we have to actually then begin to look at, are we in the right place as lawyers? And we have to work with community groups that are thinking about how do we mobilize a base. And as lawyers, we can be helpful, but we can only be helpful in working in collaboration with a larger campaign, and the campaign strategy should not be directed by us, I don't think, if we are going to be acting as lawyers. We still have a role, but it's a limited one.
We're going to now move to the last segment, the last question that I have for folks about defining the wins, framing wins. How do you do that when we are working often towards such long-term, and as Maria said, kind of really vision-like goals. And after that segment, I think hopefully we'll have a few minutes for audience members either to ask questions of our panelists, but we are also very curious to hear, what are the false solutions that you're fighting against? How do you know that they're false? What tactics are you using? Or what are the real solutions that you're working towards, if you want to share that as well? So we'll have that at the end so you can start thinking about that. But in terms of defining the wins and tracking progress, how do you give hope to your fellow colleagues or staff that are more junior? How do you report to funders if that's what's necessary? How do you even kind of keep yourself in check to make sure you are moving towards a just transition? So if I could start maybe this time with you, Maria, at the end.
Yeah, I think for me, keeping track is like, again, if you can stir the hearts of your own community. Because I think we do need to have that honest self-reflection. I call it sober assessment. Sober assessment about where we're at. Because if we are having, these high-level discussions, but folks in our community aren't even aware that this is happening, might be happening, then we're starting to replicate the behaviors of mainstream organizations, right? And I think that that's always what's made EJ unique. I'm personally affected by this. I know what it stinks like, I have asthma, like my mom's on a respirator, right? Like these things matter, and they matter in terms of what the skin in the game. And not just, we need people at these tables with skin in the game where it's not theoretical. It's not like, oh, I have a bleeding heart and I have a lot of empathy and compassion. That's awesome, but we need people at the table who are directly impacted. And then we can't be like, oh, well, I'm directly impacted, so I have absolute power. Absolutely not. I'm directly impacted and I'm still serving my community. Right? I have to go back and be accountable to a group of people, to be accountable to each other as colleagues in this work about how when I compromise, I've compromised other people's work, right? And so if I am going to compromise, because sometimes you might have to, there better be then discussions with other colleagues in the work about how your compromise then affects their strategy. Because I think we're all together until we're alone being pressed in a room, right? And so we can't let those bonds kind of break us up. And we got to be honest and more vulnerable with each other. Like, I am feeling squeezed. My organization's about to go under if I don't make this compromise. And just put it on the table. People may be more understanding than we think, right? Because we also can't be so hard on each other. Because I'm always like, I don't really appreciate that I'm not going to call you a sellout because I don't know what you were up against. I don't know what the specifics of your situation might be, so I do try to extend that grace, but I guess I would try to ask us to really just make the effort, cold call somebody, right? Don't send them an email. We know what that is. It's into nothing. Try to find their number, call them up, be like, hey, I might not know you, but my work might affect you if I do this, right? And just ask, right? So let's do more of that amongst community groups. I don't know what the question was, but that's my answer.
That's a great answer. I think, the world is a lot, and in nonprofit spaces, in the work, we are all deeply impacted by it every day, and whether and how we acknowledge that, and whether and how the systems that we're working in acknowledge that, has an impact, right? I'm reflecting you could pick anything from the last 7 years, right? But I'm thinking about, particularly for me, being a white and Latina person at a predominantly Black organization during the height of the police killings a couple of years ago, and just the weight that I felt, I know was nothing, not comparable to the weight of my colleagues and my friends, and just checking in on people as people, even as we're doing the work, I think is one thing. And I also, just as a movement, we're not great at celebrating the wins. We're terrible at it, right? And I think I think taking the time to celebrate for ourselves and to have that joy even as the world is burning is one thing. And I think also framing it to funders and to our partners as incremental victories when we get them is important. And like just to take a minute to give an example, we've been involved, my organization has been involved in litigation challenging the siting of what was a coal-fired power plant, now is a gas-fired power plant proposal in an EJ community just outside of Boston, predominantly black and brown and low income, has the highest pediatric asthma rate in the state, was a hotspot for COVID, all of those wonderful things. We've been involved in that fight for over 15 years. There have been at least 4 attorneys from our office who have worked on that case pro bono that we're doing with folks in private practice, and couldn't have done that work without them. But because we've stayed in that fight for as long as we have, and because the legal landscape has changed a little bit, and because of COVID, we were able to actually request relief in that case in the form of a health impact assessment because it had been so damn long since they had done one, and because of a case that came out of Virginia saying that there needed to be a stronger EJ assessment, that we won the first health impact assessment in Massachusetts that had been granted by DEP. Yeah. And I mean, that case is still ongoing. There's a lot more to the story. Who knows when it will end? It's one of those zombie things. But I think it is important to share that with folks to say, like, no, health impact assessments won't stop what you are fighting and are not like the silver bullet, but is one way that, you know, lawyers and public health professionals can help you to draw things out and give you more evidence for your, you know, to put fuel to the fire for your fight. And then I guess just the one last thing, I think just being able to be in touch with folks the way we are today here, the way we are through CJA regionally and through the Just Transition Lawyering Network, like being a part of that during COVID and when things were so hard was also life-giving because I got to be in spaces with other lawyers who were thinking about what are the limits of the law and how do we how do we use what we know to get us out of this mess.
I'll just add one more piece on this. These have been wonderful discussions about this. I love the idea that this is not false solutions. Instead, I would say away from dead ends, because some of what we're dealing about here are dead ends that people have put forward to us, which is really just keeping things going in the status quo. Sometimes that's stopping something, and when you can stop something, that's a success that we should celebrate. So one of the things I did want to point to as a past win that I try and tell my students about is the United States Navy. You might have heard of them. They had a problem. The problem was that a bunch of white suburbanites had built homes right around a training facility that they had in Norfolk and Virginia. And the solution to the problem was that the problem they perceived was that these people, or homeowners, were complaining and actually suing the Navy for noise impacts and environmental impacts due to this training exercise. One of their proposed solutions was to move that landing strip down to a freed slave community called the Sandbanks, unincorporated town that was in Gates County, North Carolina. That community came together, and I want to say, when I say came together, that community, I mean the descendants of the formerly enslaved people in the Sandbanks and the descendants of the owners of the plantations on which they had served. That community came together, and I worked with that community, listening to what they had to say with my students about what needed to be done. And we prepared and produced our own Citizens EIS. You know, we did our own citizens version of that. Now, ours wasn't as fancy, it wasn't as expensive as the one the Navy was putting together, not by 3 orders of magnitude. But the Navy ended up stopping. Now, did it stop because we did the EIS? No. It did it because we had a coordinated, nonviolent direct action campaign of influence, which had a legal component to it. But it was community-led. That's the way things can do. And that community has stayed talking to one another. They have stayed engaged as a community, and they still have not given up on how do we find a future for our small rural community where the Navy thought, hey, this is a great place for a dump. You know, in this case, it was a noise dump and a gas dump. But there's a facility like that waiting to come to many places near every one of us. And there are many communities that have been host to those. So I just think it's about getting the community foremost and front and center. And then when you bring alongside allies, we have to be on tap but not on top. Technical assistance providers, that's what we should be, TAP, technical assistance providers. We are not the solution. We are just assistants.
I think we're gonna write that one down and use tap but not on top. That's really good. Okay, so I want to give a few minutes if folks want to, from the audience, anybody have any specific questions for our panelists. I see I will come over with the microphone. I think maybe that'll be the easiest. And if, questions or any knowledge that you want to share, any experiences, and please introduce yourself.
That's what happens when you shoot your hand up like first. So, hi everyone, my name is Raya Salter. I'm the founder and executive director of an organization called the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center. I'm on the national policy table for the Movement for Black Lives, and sit on New York State's Climate Action Council. And the false solutions piece, we've, in New York State, been working and continue to work against false solutions. And I think where I end with that is really what Maria said, which is we're at a moment in time and we're not in a good place. But I wanted to say just a few other things because I wanted to uplift what you said. I'm not a litigator, I'm an oil, energy and utilities, attorney. And so there are a lot of niches and a lot of places, where people can engage. And I also, though, as much as I hear you on the tap, I hear you 1,000%. And I just want to also uplift that there are a lot of lawyers, especially Black, femme, and lawyers of color, who are very actively working, in this space of being community lawyers. And so as we say tap, and we need to say that, technical assistance only, et cetera, remember, though, we also need to be supported in our work and our theories, which critical race theory, need to be supported in this work, so because it's not only a binary. So that's all I wanted to share.
Do you want to pass this? Yeah, please. Oh, okay. I thought, is any other? Okay, let's take this.
Let me introduce myself. I'm Esther Baldwin. I am the policy and engagement manager for an organization called the Black Appalachian Coalition. We're working to uplift the voices and histories of Black people who have been left out of policy. And we're doing their stories as a precursor to policy change. So I'm new to this space. Environmental law, environmental work is something I'm very new to. I come to this from campaign work, really. And I just had a question about something you said, which is carbon centrism is in itself a false solution. Why, as a new person to this space?
Yeah. Maria, do you want to take that? Or, yeah? You want to start and I'll add?
Yeah. Because I call it carbon essentialism, right? It's just the focus on greenhouse gas reduction, which is just focusing on carbon. How are we going to get the carbon down? And in our communities, I'll just quick Ironbound, we're 4 square miles. We have 3 power plants, the largest sludge facility, sewage waste treatment facility, the largest incinerator. We're surrounded by the longest Superfund site in the country, 17 miles, right, where Agent Orange was produced. We have over 100 brownfield sites. And I'm going to just stop there because it's depressing, right? And I could keep going, and I'm not even going in a 3-mile radius. When we talk about the things that are coming out of those smokestacks, it's not just carbon. It's NOx, it's mercury, it's arsenic, it's dioxin. It's things that there's mad schools in my neighborhood, right? We play outside. We're trying to have a community gardens. Our chickens might be feeding us back out poison, right, through their eggs. So when we just focus on carbon because we're worried about climate, we are, again, doing the greater good thing. Well, we're going to sacrifice communities so hydrogen produces NOx, one example. Natural gas was another thing sold to us as a bridge, right? But then natural gas has all these other things that are produced. And so given because of racism, all these facilities are in Black and brown neighborhoods, and they're killing Black and brown people. And so if you're just focused on reducing carbon, you're not actually addressing the things that stress out our communities. And right now, we're again being sold for the greater good, we might have to sacrifice you electric vehicles, right? most people in my neighborhood don't own a car, like, so when we focus on electric vehicles, all you're doing is displacing the emissions, right? So instead of them being in the transportation sector, they're in the electric sector. Well, I have 3 power plants in my neighborhood. So we're gonna burn more, and I'm glad that now that pollution that was in a white neighborhood from that emission is gone, but now it's actually been put onto my lungs. So that's, I think, that big picture. And so we have a chance through an existential crisis to transform a racist situation, right? And to actually come out, I think, with a different society that doesn't make these really, sacrifices communities in exchange for what's perceived as greater good.
Can I add something to that real quick? I think the other thing is that a lot of these, the solutions around carbon rely on like putting a market value on carbon, right? You're monetizing what it is. Who gets to decide that? How expensive is it? There are many different ways you can go about doing that. And to Maria's point, it takes away the focus from the people who are still going to be impacted by whatever it is you do. The people who are still breathing the air in the places where those emissions are. And in Boston, in Roxbury, where I work, we have one of the biggest bus depots in the city that, thanks to our work, is now mostly buses that are natural gas, which is, again, still a problem. You have people, like black folks in Boston, wait 64 more hours for the bus than white folks. And for Latina folks, it's 11 hours. So that's waiting outside, breathing all of that dirty air. With the TCI example, again, just in the transportation world, as was said, like a bunch of big academic institutions did a whole study that they framed as being positive, in that this would bring down emissions and would result in public health benefits. But when you peeled back what those results were, the disparities in air quality in our communities are still going to exist in 2032. And that was the stuff that kept me up at night about that policy. Like, even if it's implemented in the most equitable possible way. And so I think coming at things from the carbon-centric model, also, it doesn't account for the structural racism, it doesn't account for the impact on people, and it allows for you to feel good about things like, oh, the company that I'm contributing to is building, contributing to rebuilding the rainforest. What's that doing for your people, right?
The example that you gave about the focus on the methane, right? Not carbon per se, right? But it's this rhetoric like, oh, we have to do this to save the climate. And what we're actually seeing now, which I think is sometimes dangerous, is, again, a false solution or rhetoric, is sometimes we have been hearing from national environmental groups, which should be our allies in this fight for climate justice, is like, well, we don't have time to deal with the justice and equity issues. And sometimes, which is even more insulting and worse, it's, well, to help some of those poor countries, Bangladesh over there, we need to force some kind of climate policy over here that's basically gonna have racist impacts and perpetuate the inequities, right? Completely ignoring the fact that there has been a movement of solidarity, in fact, right, between environmental justice, marginalized communities in one place and another. So that is something very kind of dangerous, I think, that we have to guard against. And I just wanted to really put that out there. So do we have any other questions? Yes, Claire.
Leo Simchanyavi. Sorry, everyone. I know everyone's waiting for lunch. So my name is Mia Montoya Hammersley. I'm the director of the Environmental Justice Clinic at the Vermont Law and Graduate School. I'm also a member of the Piramansatewa tribe, which is a Pueblo community in New Mexico, and I'm gonna just speak as a tribal member and not in my director hat for a moment. But a false solution that I have seen coming up a lot, particularly in the Southwest, is nuclear power. And I don't know, I'd love to connect with anyone who is also trying to address that issue in their communities and being pushed as like a fossil fuel-free solution, and just coming from a community that has been heavily, heavily impacted by the full life cycle of nuclear power generation and nuclear weapons testing from the uranium mining that continues to impact a lot of indigenous communities in northern New Mexico, to nuclear weapons testing. I'm a descendant of a downwinder community that was impacted by the Trinity nuclear test in the White Sands in 1945. And then also storage. New Mexico is one of the places, Holtec, for example, is just every year they come to there's a legislative request to, ease regulations to make it easier for them to bring more and more nuclear waste into the state, into southern New Mexico in particular, which is a majority brown and indigenous community. So I just wanted to raise that because I haven't heard it talked about in this space yet, and I'd love to connect with any folks who are doing organizing around that. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're at the time where we'll have just closing words, one last round from folks at this table. If there's any other questions in the audience, please, like I said, bring them up to our panelists or at lunch. We'd be happy to continue talking.
I'll just have one more. I would like to amend my previous statement about if the solution comes from a lawyer. If a solution comes from a white lawyer who looks like me. To honor Raya's point very well, I mean, I consider myself to be reconstructing and trying to learn, but the honest truth is that one of the biggest problems we do have is a lack of representation in the legal community. So amend that earlier. That was spoken from my privilege, saying that it should be white lawyers coming to you with solutions. Be skeptical. Here you go.
Sofia, do you have any last words, Maria?
I think Maria's done. No, I think the last thing that I'll say is just as a lawyer, white, Latina, queer, you carry all those identities with you. Being a lawyer, passing the bar, getting that self-laminated piece of paper gives you a hell of a lot of power. And so I think particularly when we are thinking about how we use that power, if we're not sitting with it and feeling uncomfortable about the things that are coming from our clients and our communities is a problem.
Well, now that only lawyers spoke, right, then I guess I'll say something else, because you can't, I love the lawyers I work with, but I'm still like, we got to empower our community, because it is intimidating to be with folks, that have passed bars and that have PhDs. And, I've been taught and conditioned that I'm not good enough and I don't know enough. And policy is this secret world that belongs to really, really smart people. And I think learning that policy is just, let's figure out how to write these rules in a common sense way, right? That anybody could read. They don't need to make them that complicated, right? They just choose to, because that perpetuates racism, inequality, right? And so let's get our communities more involved, and let's just show them people like us, right? In this room with lawyers, and that we all play our part, because I'm not diminishing, lawyers are important, but we all play our part to get this done, and we need to all play our role.
Thank you. Yes, please. Thank our panelists. Thank you, everybody.